Berlin, the capital of the Third Reich, became the last stage of a war that had devastated Europe for almost 6 years. The streets were covered in smoke, debris and fire, while gunshots echoed among ruined buildings and columns of civilians advanced aimlessly under the sound of artillery. In the depths of the city, under layers of concrete and earth, some of the main leaders of the regime locked themselves in somber corridors, surrounded by useless maps and meaningless orders. Outside, the city crumbled with each bombardment, and the few who remained in command disappeared one by one in silence, while the fighting intensified on every corner. The end was imminent, but no one outside yet knew what had happened underground. What exactly happened in the last days of that power that refused until the end to surrender? The night of the 16th of April, 1945, thousands of searchlights suddenly turned on and broke the darkness in front of the German positions on the Oder front, illuminating the enemy lines as if it were broad daylight. That powerful artificial light, generated by more than 140 searchlights, pointed west from the ranks of the First Belarusian Front. Although the projectors had initially been used in night operations, Marshal Zhukov had decided to use them on this occasion to dazzle the German defenders, help the infantry advance through the muddy terrain, and generate a psychological effect similar to that of a bombardment. However, the weather conditions and the suspended dust considerably reduced visibility, which made the effect less impactful than expected. Even so, at 3 in the morning an artillery attack began that lasted about 30 minutes and preceded the general advance of the Soviet infantry. Zhukov's plan consisted of breaking the German defences on the Silo Heights and then heading towards Berlin from the east. Those hills were the last natural barrier protecting the German capital. The Soviets had concentrated an enormous force for the operation, with more than 2.5 million soldiers, around 6,500 tanks, almost 8,000 planes, and more than 40,000 artillery pieces. For their part, the Germans barely had a total of about 300,000 men, a reduced number of tanks and anti-tank weapons, and many of their units were made up of members of the Volkssturm, young people from the Hitler Youth and older veterans without recent combat experience. The Battle of Silo was one of the most intense on the Eastern Front. Soviet troops encountered much stronger resistance than expected. The German defences were well organised in several successive lines, and had taken advantage of the elevated terrain to locate machine gun nests and anti-tank pieces. Furthermore, the muddy terrain due to recent rains and the destruction of roads seriously complicated the advance of Soviet vehicles, which became stuck or were easy targets from the heights. During the first days, casualties were very high and the advance was slow, which caused Zhukov's frustration as he failed to meet the planned deadlines. Meanwhile, further south, the First Ukrainian Front, under the command of Marshal Konev, had achieved faster advances. His troops, supported by a large number of tanks, had penetrated the German defences and were approaching the southern flank of Berlin. This situation generated an implicit competition between the two Soviet marshals, as Stalin had encouraged a certain rivalry between them, giving them similar instructions to try to be the first to reach the centre of the capital. That tension between the Soviet commands influenced the pace and intensity of operations. In Berlin, the civilian population lived in an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. Although the regime's propaganda insisted that victory was still possible and that reinforcements would arrive on time, many knew that the end was near. The sound of cannons was heard closer and closer, and the columns of smoke visible on the horizon announced the proximity of the fighting. Train stations were filled with families trying to flee west, although it was becoming increasingly difficult to find transportation. The authorities had ordered the evacuation of essential officials and employees, but thousands of civilians, mostly women, the elderly and children, remained in the city without knowing what awaited them. The Nazi regime had desperately mobilized all available male population. The Volkssturm, a militia formed by adolescents and older men, had been activated en masse and had been given antiquated weapons or weapons captured from other fronts. Many of them had no military training and did not know the correct use of the equipment. In some cases, they were sent to the front with incomplete uniforms and without logistical support. Despite this, propaganda continued to extol their role as heroic defenders of the homeland. In schools, teachers taught children how to use hand grenades, while improvised trenches were dug in the courtyards. Some adolescents were recruited directly from classrooms and sent to the front without saying goodbye to their families. Mothers silently watched their underage sons march off to battle, with the promise that they would be helping to save Germany. In reality, many would die in a matter of days without really knowing what they were fighting for. Morale in the German high command was completely broken. Hitler was in his bunker under the Chancellery, isolated from the outside world, receiving unrealistic reports and rejecting any suggestion of withdrawal or surrender. He insisted that the Soviets would be stopped at the gates of Berlin and that new secret weapons would change the course of the war. Meanwhile, his generals knew that all was lost, but they did not dare to openly contradict him. Some tried to gain time, others simply hoped that it would all end soon. As the days passed, the encirclement of Berlin tightened. Soviet troops of the First Belarusian Front finally managed to break through the defences at Silo after several days of fierce fighting and advanced towards the city from the east, while units of the First Ukrainian Front approached from the south. The capital was completely surrounded, and although some German units continued to resist in dispersed sectors, most escape routes had already been cut. On the outskirts of the city, columns of refugees mixed with retreating military units. Carts with wounded, bicycles, wheelbarrows, and even horse-drawn carts piled up on the roads, looking for an exit that no longer existed. Air and artillery bombardments were constant, and in many cases directly hit civilian convoys. The line between the combat front and the rear had completely blurred. Churches filled with people praying in silence, while public buildings were converted into command centers or improvised shelters. Hospitals were saturated and lacked the most basic supplies. Doctors operated without anesthesia, and the wounded were treated in hallways or on improvised tables. Despite the chaos, many continued to believe that the Western Allies would arrive before the Soviets and occupy Berlin, which turned out to be an unfounded hope. The last weeks before the fall were marked by an atmosphere of fatalism, but also of senseless resistance. In some neighborhoods, residents dug trenches in their gardens, while in others, groups organized to prepare Molotov cocktails. Leaflets continued to announce final victory, although no one believed them anymore. The sounds of explosions were constant, and with each passing day, the city crumbled a little more. The combat did not develop with defined lines as in other previous battles, but everything happened in a total confusion where each section of the city was taken as it was cleared. The troops moved in small groups, entering houses and buildings one by one, and many times the German soldiers waited for them with fire from the upper floors or from basements connected to each other. The Soviets responded with flamethrowers and explosives and tore down walls to avoid having to use doors or windows that could be mined. On some occasions, they broke through floors with grenades or simply brought down ceilings with charges placed on the upper floors. Most of the dwellings were already empty, but in many places there were still civilians hidden in basements, in tunnels, or even among the rubble. German resistance was irregular and chaotic. Some groups fought with an almost suicidal obstinacy, especially members of the Volkssturm and some Waffen-SS soldiers, while others simply surrendered as soon as they lost contact with their superiors or ran out of ammunition. The number of prisoners increased every day, and many of them were barely adolescents or elderly people who did not even know how to handle a weapon correctly. The Soviet army, for its part, had strict orders not to show compassion to those who offered resistance, but in practice, some commanders allowed surrenders if the Germans did not resist. Artillery continued to pound the center of Berlin without pause, and the soldiers entering the city did so amidst constant smoke, flames, and explosions. Many of the streets no longer existed as such, and what remained were corridors of ruins, full of burned vehicles, uncollected corpses, and scattered furniture, remains everywhere. Berlin's underground became a second battlefield. Metro lines, sewers, and tunnels connecting buildings were used by German defenders to move from one place to another, avoid detection, and prepare ambushes. Some explosions caused the collapse of entire sections of the underground system, and in other cases, the Soviets themselves dropped bombs or threw grenades to force combatants out. The scenes inside these tunnels were of total chaos, with shouts, cries, smoke, and bodies strewn everywhere. On the surface, fighting continued without pause. In many areas, the Soviets had to fight for every building, every floor, every room. It was a slow and exhausting struggle, where control of a single block could cost dozens of casualties. Soldiers took turns advancing, taking cover, and clearing captured areas. On some occasions, German snipers managed to halt the advance for hours, hidden on rooftops or in church towers. The Soviets responded with concentrated fire, blowing up buildings suspected of harboring enemies. The use of tanks was limited by the narrowness of the streets and the large number of improvised barricades. But even so, they managed to advance, firing at point-blank range against building entrances and windows. Self-propelled guns accompanied the infantry and destroyed fortified positions before the soldiers entered to clear the ground. The Germans no longer had means to remove their dead, and the Soviets did not stop to do so. The city smelled of burning, decomposing bodies and damp rubble. The civilian population tried to survive in hiding, without water or electricity, fearing both the fighting and reprisals. Many tried to dig deeper shelters or sought new entrances to the metro. Radios no longer broadcasted, and information spread by word of mouth, often altered or incomplete. Some still believed that reinforcements would arrive, that Wenck would appear with his troops to break the encirclement, but most began to resign themselves to the inevitable. The Reichstag became one of the most important symbolic objectives. Its conquest had propaganda value for the Soviets, and its proximity to Hitler's bunker made it a priority target. The building was partially destroyed, but it still housed well-armed defenders. The fight to take it was fierce, with hand-to-hand combat on the stairs, in the interior rooms, and even in the dark corridors full of dust and smoke. The Soviet troops who participated in the capture were congratulated by their commanders, and red flags were allowed to be hoisted on the rooftop, although many photographs were taken later in prepared poses to record the moment. Despite its symbolic importance, the Reichstag was not the last defensive stronghold, and in other parts of Berlin the fighting continued with equal intensity. Inside the Nazi command center, the situation was increasingly chaotic. The reports arriving were contradictory, and Hitler continued to demand impossible counterattacks with troops that no longer existed. Orders were sent that never reached their destination, or were ignored by commanders who were already acting on their own. The command structure collapsed as the encirclement tightened. Goebbels continued broadcasting speeches by radio until the last moment, promising a victory that no one believed. Some high-ranking officers were already thinking of escape or ending everything by their own hand, and were preparing for the total collapse of the regime. Meanwhile, fighting continued a few streets from the heart of Nazi power, and explosions could already be heard clearly from the underground areas of the Chancellery. Conditions for civilians were getting worse and worse. There was no electricity or running water, and food was scarce. The few hospitals still operating were overwhelmed and lacked basic supplies. In many parts of the city, residents tried to organize to share what little remained. They cooked with wood gathered from broken furniture and boiled contaminated water in the hope of making it potable. Mothers tried to calm the children while cannons roared outside. Some civilians were hit by bombardments while queuing for bread or water. Those who could move tried to leave the city, but almost all routes were cut off or too dangerous. Many resigned themselves to waiting for the end in improvised basements, fearing what was to come. The morale of the German troops deteriorated rapidly. Most soldiers knew there would be no retreat or reinforcements. Some continued fighting out of fear of reprisals, others out of blind obedience, or simply because they had no other option. There were units that dissolved without warning, soldiers who changed clothes to blend in with civilians, and officers who disappeared without a trace. Those who continued fighting did so in small groups, often without communication with their superiors. Ammunition was scarce, and in some cases they fought with captured or improvised weapons. The nights were just as dangerous as the day, and the sound of gunshots and explosions was constant. There was no rest or pause. The city was a battlefield without truce. The Red Army, for its part, maintained constant pressure. Divisions advanced on all fronts, occupying key sectors such as the Air Ministry, the Interior Ministry, and the Chancellery area. Each block taken meant new casualties, but also the definitive weakening of the enemy. Resistance continued in some points, but the pace of advance did not stop. Soviet commanders knew that the end was near, and many competed to be the first to reach the city center. Prestige and recognition before Stalin depended on who hoisted the flag over the key buildings. This internal competition also generated errors, but the numerical and firepower superiority was such that there was no real possibility of an effective German counterattack. When the capital was surrounded and the gunfire did not cease for an instant, thousands of people sought refuge in basements and subway tunnels, trying to escape the roar of the bombs and the total collapse that was already anticipated. In every underground corner, between cracked concrete walls and accumulated dampness, entire families huddled on makeshift mattresses, sharing cramped spaces with strangers, with the smells of fear, confinement, and exhaustion floating in the air. Hospitals no longer had available beds, and doctors tried to attend to the wounded without anesthesia, with the materials they still had left, and with the constant hum of projectiles falling overhead. Each day it was harder to find something to eat. Markets no longer opened, warehouses were empty, and canned food had run out weeks ago. People briefly went out into the streets, risking their lives to search for scraps of bread or some rotten potato, but in many cases they returned with empty hands. Those who could not go out, such as the elderly or the wounded, depended on the little that others managed to bring. Some groups began to cook in cans or improvised stoves in the tunnels, but even getting water became a complicated task because many pipes had been destroyed. The makeshift shelters used as hospitals could no longer contain more people. The wounded arrived by dozens, most with amputations, burns, or embedded shrapnel, and lined up on the floor awaiting care that never arrived. Doctors did what they could with dirty bandages, rusty instruments, and without electricity. In some cases, limbs were amputated without anesthesia, only with a cloth in the mouth to bite back the pain. Screams filled the corridors, mixing with the echoes of distant explosions that never ceased to be heard. As the fighting approached the city center, the underground shelters became a mix of fear and desperation. News spread quickly, but no one knew what was true and what was not. Some said the Russians were already in the Central Park, others claimed they had reached the station. In those enclosed spaces, darkness and heat worsened the tension. Many children cried incessantly, some adults murmured prayers, others simply remained silent, staring into the void, hoping it would all end at once. There were people who tried to keep themselves useful. Some helped distribute water or organize the youngest. There were also those who, despite the hunger, shared the little they had left. But that did not prevent arguments from breaking out. On more than one occasion, two families almost came to blows over a piece of dry bread or a space next to a wall where the cold was felt less. The pressure of confinement and constant fear was wearing down everyone's nerves. Any loud noise could trigger a generalized panic attack. The subway tunnels, originally designed for rapid passenger transport, were transformed into corridors of survivors. In certain sections, the tracks were used as sleeping space. Some used pieces of wood as beds, others simply lay down on blankets. There were areas where water accumulated, so those who slept there spent their nights with wet feet. At some points, latrines were improvised with buckets or holes in the ground. The smell was unbearable, but no one complained because they knew it was much worse outside. Communication between shelters was limited. Some people offered to go out briefly to look for news or notify acquaintances in other tunnels, but the danger was constant. On more than one occasion, a projectile impacted near the exits, trapping or killing those trying to ascend. Even so, there were those who risked everything just to find out if their mother, brother, or friend was still alive. When someone returned with news, everyone crowded to listen, although the news was almost always bad. Air attacks did not cease, neither by day nor by night. Even underground, the roar was so loud that it was felt in the chest, like a blunt blow that never ended. The walls trembled with each impact, and in some shelters, roofs or walls collapsed, leaving dozens of people trapped without possibility of rescue. As the days passed, the city crumbled upon its own foundations. Every street, every building, every park transformed into a field of ruins. In many families, hope was no longer spoken of. Endurance was spoken of. Some adults made calculations with what bread they had left, dividing it into tiny portions to last a few more days. Others saved pieces of soap or pills to use as currency for exchange if they happened to find someone with something to eat. Children, for the most part, no longer played. They huddled with their mothers or slept for hours due to exhaustion, malnutrition, and cold. The situation in hospitals was no different. Operating rooms were dark, generators no longer worked, and patients crowded in corridors, courtyards, and basements. Surgeries were performed with flashlights or candles. Infections spread rapidly. There were cases of gangrene, tetanus, pneumonia, and there were no medicines to treat anything. Nurses made their rounds in silence, knowing that many times they could only sit beside the dying to hold their hand until they passed away. Authorities no longer had control over the situation. Some party members tried to maintain order in the tunnels or coordinate food deliveries, but no one listened to them anymore. Many had left or hidden. Command had collapsed. The only thing that still functioned was the instinct to survive. Each person protected their own as best they could. There were those who refused to share their food reserves, while others, with their gaze already dimmed, distributed the last of what they had as if they knew there would be no tomorrow. In some sectors, the fighting came so close that the shelters trembled with each explosion. It was said that there were houses under which hand-to-hand battles were being fought. Gunshots were heard directly overhead, and at times bullets pierced the roofs of the basements. Entire families died buried by collapses without anyone being able to do anything. Some survivors recounted that they spent days trapped among rubble, drinking their own urine to avoid dying of thirst. Fear of the Red Army also crept into conversations. There was talk of looting, rape, vengeance. Many civilians tried to place improvised signs on basement doors, indicating that there were children, elderly or wounded, hoping that this would prevent the worst. Some women looked for old clothes to appear older or sick. Others cut their hair or covered themselves in soot to go unnoticed. Desperation mixed with uncertainty, and no one knew what to expect when the troops finally entered. The city, from below, no longer looked the same. The sounds that reached them were strange, fragmented, like from another world. Distant explosions, engines, isolated shots, screams rising through the ventilation grills. At some moments, everything fell silent for a few seconds, which generated more anxiety than the noise itself. In those moments, many thought that perhaps everything had ended. But immediately, another burst of artillery broke the calm, and everything started again. This was how it was every day, every night, without pause, without truce, without answers. On the 1st of May, the day after Hitler took his own life, Goebbels gathered General Krebs and General Bergdorf, along with his wife Magda and their 6 children, in the same bunker. The atmosphere was dense, everyone knew what was coming. Goebbels had declared that he would not leave Berlin alive and had no intention of allowing his family to do so either. One by one, the children were put to sleep with morphine and then killed with cyanide capsules while they slept. Magda and Joseph took their own lives shortly after. Outside, the Russians continued to advance through the destroyed streets. At the same time, in other corners of the bunker and in the outer courtyards, other suicides were occurring. General Hans Krebs, who had tried to negotiate a partial surrender with the Soviets the day before, also took his own life upon realizing that the terms would not be accepted. Wilhelm Bergdorf did the same. The feeling of decay was total. Those remaining in the bunker only thought of surrendering, escaping, or dying. The Third Reich was literally disintegrating before their very eyes. In parallel, General Weidling, commander of Berlin's defense, finally decided to surrender the city. He had been loyal to his orders until the last moment, but seeing that there were no defenses left and that chaos consumed everything, he understood that resistance was futile. On the morning of the 2nd of May, he sent messengers to the Soviets to offer unconditional surrender. Berlin, after days of house-to-house fighting and thousands of dead, officially fell. German soldiers began to surrender by hundreds. Some still carried weapons, others simply raised their hands. Meanwhile, the situation on the surface was one of absolute collapse. The city was in ruins, full of decomposing corpses, rubble, smoke, Soviet tanks everywhere, and isolated gunshots. Surviving civilians slowly emerged from the cellars where they had been confined for weeks, seeking water, food, or simply trying to understand if it was all over. Many did not know that Hitler was dead. Others did not believe it. Fear, mistrust, and confusion covered everything. Once the surrender was confirmed, Soviet troops secured the bunker's accesses. There they found a desolate scene. The bodies of Goebbels, his wife and his children were partially burned, as were the remains of Hitler and Eva Braun. In several rooms, remains of suicides, abandoned weapons and scattered documents were found. The Soviets took control of the site, although initially they did not immediately announce that Hitler had died. Stalin demanded proof, and for days rumors, theories, and even contradictory versions circulated among the Soviet command. In the days that followed, the Soviets carried out a detailed investigation into what had happened in the bunker. They interrogated the few living witnesses, took personal items, blueprints, and fragments of the corpses. Through dental analysis, they identified Hitler's remains. However, for political and propaganda reasons, Moscow did not reveal all the information and allowed confusion to persist for a time. For the Soviet soldiers, what was important was that Berlin had fallen and the enemy had been defeated. With the official surrender, the attempt to defend the last German units in Berlin also ended. The Waffen-SS, which had offered fierce resistance in some sectors, finally laid down their arms or were annihilated. In total, more than 100,000 German soldiers were captured in the capital. Some tried to escape disguised as civilians, others committed suicide before being captured. Soviet generals, such as Trikov and Zhukov, received congratulations from the High Command and were recognized as responsible for the victory in the enemy capital. The city was completely destroyed. The center of Berlin was an unrecognizable field of ruins. Iconic buildings such as the Reichstag, the Chancellery, or the Anhalter Bahnhof station had been bombed until reduced to empty structures. Rubble covered entire streets and fires still burned in some neighborhoods. The bridges were dynamited, water and electricity systems collapsed. There was no transport nor sufficient food. The civilian population wandered disoriented among the city's ruins, not knowing what would happen to them or who would govern now. During the following days, the Soviets organized the military control of the city. Vigilance points were established, still-standing buildings were requisitioned to house commands and hospitals, and captured Nazi officials began to be interrogated. In parallel, reports of abuses against the civilian population, especially women, began. Many Berliners feared reprisals and violence. The Red Army, after years of brutal war, showed little compassion. Soviet propaganda had fueled hatred for a long time, and now, with victory in hand, the spirit of vengeance was evident. As for the Nazi command, there was no longer a central structure. With Hitler, Goebbels, Himmler and others dead or disappeared, no recognized authority remained. Dönitz, Hitler's designated successor, had formed a government in the north, but lacked real power. From Flensburg, he tried to negotiate a partial surrender with the Western Allies, but the Soviets did not accept it. The war in Europe was practically over, only isolated pockets of resistance remained. German divisions still active received contradictory orders or simply surrendered on their own. The civilian population tried to adapt to the new reality. With the fall of the Nazi regime, an absolute power vacuum occurred. There was no police, no food distribution, no basic services. Many former officials tried to disappear among the population. Others were captured by the Soviets and sent to prisoner camps. Radio stations went silent and newspapers ceased to circulate. Life in Berlin, already hard due to bombings and shortages, became even more chaotic. Some residents began to organize to distribute food or clean streets. Amidst this disorganization, the search for archives and documents also began. The Soviets collected thousands of papers, files, photos and records of all kinds, both from the Nazi Party and the army. They were particularly interested in materials on weaponry, technology, intelligence networks and scientific experiments. Many of these documents were taken to Moscow and studied in secret. Scientists, engineers and technical officers were also arrested for interrogation or transfer to the Soviet Union as part of the technological recovery effort. During the following weeks, victory parades were organized in different Soviet cities. In Moscow, Stalin was celebrated as the great leader who had defeated Hitler. In Berlin, Soviet soldiers raised their flag over the ruins of the Reichstag, an image that would be used as a symbol of triumph. At the same time, Soviet authorities began to plan the administration of their occupation zone. Soon, political commissions, intelligence agents and Communist Party officials would arrive to establish the new order in what would become East Germany. Internationally, the fall of Berlin marked the definitive close of the conflict in Europe. Shortly after, on the 8th of May, Germany signed the unconditional surrender in Reims and then in Berlin, in the presence of Soviet, American, British and French representatives. The war in Europe had ended. The Allied powers then began to discuss the future of Germany, the territorial division, the trial of Nazi officials, and the reconstruction of the continent. Berlin, devastated and divided, would be the symbolic epicenter of that new stage that was just beginning.